Glad you're all here. My name is Ethan Smilie. I teach here at College of Ozarks in the English department. And I'm really excited to give this talk about vocation and the nature of vocations in Dante's Divine Comedy and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I'm interested in this subject for two primary reasons. One, it just fits with what I've been doing sort of professionally in presentations and publications with my brother for the last few years. My brother is a education professor in Missouri Western State University. And so what he does, what our trend's been to do, is he finds a trendy educational or pedagogical topic that's going on in the world today, and then I find some example of it in medieval literature, is usually what we do. And our case is, well, this has all been done before. But nonetheless, we see that it being a useful lens to look at the advantages and disadvantages of whatever that trend may be. And so that's one part of that. So we've done things like grit in the Canterbury Tales, critical thinking in the Canterbury Tales, school lunches in Beowulf, and Weedhall, and then sometimes I go. The other sort of love of my life besides medieval literature is Laura Ingalls Wilder, and so we've done some social capital and some stuff about playgrounds in her Little House series. So that's sort of fitting with what I'm interested in. And also more recently, I've been part of a book group reading about vocation. And so some of you heard Dr. Rapinchuk speak last night. He's in that book group here at the college with me. And Dr. Pardue, Brad Pardue, is giving a talk about Plato's Republic later. He leads that group. And there was an assertion made in one of those books that people in the Middle Ages had really, besides a religious sense, no other sense of vocation in their lives. And so I thought, that doesn't seem true to me. And so I think I'll write something about that. And so these are the reflections that come from thinking about that. And so I'll probably talk for maybe about the first half of this session, and then I want to ask some questions and lead some discussion about what we can gain regarding our modern-day notion of vocation from Dante and Chaucer. So both the Divine Comedy and the Canterbury Tales begin, in a sense, in media res. Dante is halfway to his biblically appointed Psalm 90, 70 years. And as we journey with him for a week, we get many glimpses to his past, as well as into biblical, ecclesiastical, political, and mythological past, not to mention prophecies of his future. The Canterbury Tales opens with the poet amidst a diverse company of well 9 and 20. And already in the general prologue, before the pilgrims have set out for the cathedral, the inquisitive Chaucer has ascertained all sorts of details about the backstories of most of them. But it would be just as accurate to say that both poems begin in media via, in the middle of the way, in the middle of the road. Dante is attempting to climb a mountain, but is stopped by three beasts, leopard, lion, and wolf, and Chaucer's characters, of course, are setting forth towards Canterbury on Watling Street. Dante and Chaucer and the other pilgrims are on the way, or at least on a way. Both poets are utilizing the Christian conception of the way, who is Jesus Christ, and also, by their time, the well-established notion that this life is a pilgrimage. As Aegeus puts it when counseling his son Theseus in The Knight's Tale, and by the way, most of these quotes are on this handout, and if you get bored, just look at the handout. It's more, Dante and Chaucer beat me, certainly. So as Aegeus tells his son in The Knight's Tale, this world is but a thoroughfare full of woe, and we be pilgrims, passing to and fro. Our pilgrimage is not just merely to Becket's shrine at Canterbury Cathedral, but towards the heavenly Jerusalem, where Dante ends up at the conclusion of the Paradiso. Both Dante and Chaucer display in these poems that they are supposed to be on the way, while nonetheless admitting and intricately describing the multitudinous byways that we all use to stray off the true path. And in the case of both poets, it's a matter of one's vocation that one is to be on the way. That is, one is called to be on the way. And this is not just true of the pilgrim Dante and the pilgrim Chaucer, who are the main characters of their respective poems. All people, Dante and Chaucer claim, are called to be on the way. In the case of the Divine Comedy, Dante the Pilgrim is certainly not a mere allegory. He is the Florentine poet who was born in 1265, who's now 35 years old. He's that guy who's enthralled with Beatrice, and who doesn't mention his wife, Gemma, very much. He's that guy who's soon to be exiled for the rest of his life. He's a real guy who's wandered off the path. Nevertheless, Dante the Pilgrim is also an everyman figure. The opening of the poem suggests as much. Dante the poet begins, "When I had journeyed half of our life's way, I found myself within a shadowed forest, for I had lost the path that does not stray." He is midway upon the journey of our life, nostra vita. This is the journey to heaven that we are all on. And as we learn in the poem's second canto, it's a pilgrimage that we, like Dante, though perhaps not quite so spectacularly, are called to supernaturally. In Dante's specific case, it's a rather exalted chain of command that brings him his marching orders. The Blessed Virgin Mary, St. Lucy, Beatrice, Virgil. The call Dante receives ultimately stems from and leads towards divinity. But this chain of command also reveals that our calling to pilgrimage is a result of merely human, natural sources as well. Virgil and all he represents, poetry, pagan philosophy and learning, natural intellect, is among the means by which Dante is called. Indeed, Virgil is chosen specifically because Beatrice knows the appeal and authority Virgil holds in Dante's eyes. One's vocation is a universal, supernatural call that utilizes particularized, natural means. And that's basically the same story in the first 18 lines of the Canterbury Tales, the opening of the general prologue. Excuse me as I read it to you. "One that opry with a sure suta, the drocht of march had pierced to the ruta, and bothered every vein in which liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the floor. When Zephyr's eck with his sweet breath inspired hath in every holt and hith the tender crop is, and the young sun hath in the ram his half course run. And small the fool is, mocking melody, that slipping on nicht with open knee, so pricked him nature in her courages. Then longing folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to seek in strange strondes, to Furna holloways, Couth and sundry landes, especially from every shearer's end of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, the hymneth holpen when they were seek. These famous lines are full of callings, including callings to the subhuman world. May flowers are being called up by April showers. Crops are being called up by the spring's west wind. Mother Nature is calling birds to select their mates. For more on that, see Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls. These are all natural, normal, seasonal, unconscious callings. These callings are all ordinary in the sense that they are ordained. All are following what we might call the laws of nature and nature's God. And it's no different when we move from the winds, wind that April, wind that Zephyrus, to the big then of line 12. That is, it's just as normal, ordinary, and ordained a part of life that folk desire to go on pilgrimages. As normal as flowers growing and birds singing. And every calling described here up through line 14 is universal. We're talking about all birds, all crops, all humans, all flowers, all are called. But like Dante, Chaucer moves quickly from the universal call to the particular. All people desire to go on pilgrimages. Specifically, though, English people. It doesn't matter who, it doesn't matter from which shire. They all journey to Thomas a Becket's shrine at Canterbury. And even more specifically, after the first 18 lines of the general prologue, Chaucer describes that on a specific day, in a specific place, Southwark, in a specific building, the Tabard Inn, a specific group of 30 English pilgrims is gathered. Like with Dante, vocation is a universal supernatural call that's manifested in a particularized, ordinary way. The frames of both poems suggest that each one of us particular people is called on this pilgrimage. We're all called as Christians. We all share this vocational status of pilgrim. But there are other senses in which we have particular vocations alongside our calling as a Christian. There are other ways of thinking about vocation than our general Christian call to be a pilgrim on our way to heaven. And sometimes today we neglect to consider the fact that we do have multiple callings. Today we sometimes narrow our focus and conceive our vocation merely, for instance, as our job. And in the medieval context, we should be leery about viewing vocation as merely our status of Christian pilgrim. In fact, we should probably be skeptical of the professional medieval pilgrim, who is one part wife of Bath, one part frat boy traveling to Corpus Christi on spring break. Even if we're literally on the same pilgrimage way, Dante and Chaucer indicate that we can and should hold various other vocations while on that way. Both poets themselves lived out various additional vocations. Besides following their Christian call, both obviously lived out their poetic calling, but alongside these they answered many others as well. Dante in his adolescence and early manhood was a soldier and a politician. And he lived out a political calling even when during the last decades of his life he was exiled from Florence. He continued to serve as a counselor to Florence via letters. He also addressed epistles full of advice to various kings, emperors, and cardinals. During most of his exile, he served in various advisory and ambassadorial roles to the noblemen who served as his patrons. Indeed, his political exile opened up what he conceived to be his prophetic calling that's borne out in his epistles, his prose and poetry, and his service to his patrons. Chaucer also lived out various vocations beyond the general call of Christian and the particular call of poet. Like Dante, he was a soldier and heavily involved in political life, holding a number of governmental jobs. He was an esquire in a king's household. He was an ambassador to the king. He was the controller of customs. He was the justice of peace. He was a member of parliament. He was the clerk of the king's works. And in that role, he was in charge of maintaining and building 10 royal residences. And he was also a forest official. Add to these various duties, both poets call to married life and fatherhood, though we might wish both would have more to say about family life, especially, I think, in the case of Dante, who goes on and on about Beatrice, but not so much about his wife Gemma. The characters both poets portray are no different in that they possess various multiple vocations. Dante fills hell, purgatory, and heaven with poets, philosophers, churchmen, especially popes, husbands and wives, monks and nuns, soldiers and kings, politicians, disciples, and angels. And with Dante, if you stop with the Inferno, it doesn't look good for any vocation. My time is up. That's why you should never just stop with Inferno. It doesn't matter if the bell rings. You just keep reading the Purgatorio and the Paradiso. And it's the same with the Canterbury Tales, to read all that we have extant to get the full spectrum that these poets offer. Chaucer, as Dryden put it, displays God's plenty. And there's I think it's the third page of your handout. It has a big long thing from Dryden. You don't need to look at it now, but anyway, if you're interested in it. And by that, but when he says that he displays God's plenty, Dryden means that Chaucer displays the full range of human types. And this includes a wide spectrum of vocations. Many of the pilgrims' callings can be classified within what were known then as the three estates: those who pray, those who fight, those who dig. For instance, the monk, prioress, friar, and parson are members of the first estate, the knight and esquire the second, and the plowman representative of the third. But there are plenty of callings in the tales that don't easily fit into any of those. The emerging merchant class, for instance, including the miller and the guildsman, aren't really members of what was traditionally described as the third estate. And the clerk, seemingly sort of a perpetual student, and no doubt as his title indicates a cleric, he might better fit in what we today would call academia rather than the first estate. But regardless of how one classifies each pilgrim's vocation, after finishing the general prologue, one might have a similar perception of the various vocations as one does after completing the Inferno. It doesn't look good for many of them. Who fares well besides the knight, the parson, the plowman, and maybe the clerk? And there's plenty of scholars who will even go so far to say that the knight's not so much of an ideal character himself. As both poets portray the spectrum of particular vocations held by all, for better or worse, in addition to their general Christian pilgrim vocation, the reader is well situated to ask if any vocation is better than another, or some vocations more suited to the heavenly pilgrimage. An obvious medieval answer would be yes, religious vocations are. And at times, indeed, today we use the term vocation just in this sense, as a special calling to be a minister, a priest, monk, or nun devoted to God's service. And in the Middle Ages, such a vocation was undoubtedly seen as a higher calling. In his portrait of the parson, Chaucer describes the pilgrim's ideal qualities and actions. And as doing so, he contrasts them with what was apparently more typical of real priests in his day. And he concludes, If gold rust, what shall iron do? For if a priest be foul in whom we trust, no wonder is a lewd, unlearned man to rust. Those called to the religious life are of a more noble metal than the rest of us. Clearly, that life is a higher calling. Nonetheless, one doesn't need to read much of the general prologue to see that holding a religious vocation does not ensure sanctity. Witness the friar and monk, for instance. And in my opinion, the canon, who's a cleric that comes upon the pilgrims as they're getting very near to Canterbury towards the end of the tales, but who shamefully runs off, is the only one of the pilgrims whom the reader has no hope of his salvation, of his arriving either at Canterbury Cathedral or the heavenly Jerusalem. Though the expectations are higher for those called to the religious life, Chaucer acknowledges that they can rust, and corruption of the best is the worst. Dante also privileges religious vocations. In fact, this is most clearly seen as he condemns those who hold them. And one of the first poetically fitting punishments he witnesses, that of the avaricious and prodigal clashing against one another, he's amazed by the number of clean-shaven heads he sees, that is, of clergymen. He asks Virgil, "Master, show me now what shades are these, and tell me if they're all clerics, those tonsured ones who circle on our left." To which Virgil responds, "These to the left, their heads bereft of hair, were clergymen, and popes and cardinals, with whom avarice works its excess." This is one of the few sources of wonder for Dante that leaves him soon as he continues to travel downhill, because time and time again in his descent, he meets prominent churchmen. The Simonists in the third pocket of the eighth circle of hell are a special point of emphasis for those with a religious vocation, as simony is a typically clerical sin. It's the buying and selling of spiritual things, which could include acts such as charging for sacraments or buying church offices and positions. Dante gives one of his angriest speeches during Canto 19 of the Inferno, in which he condemns Popes Nicholas III, Boniface VIII, and Clement V, the latter two before they're even dead. And this condemning speech is echoed later in heaven by a blushing St. Peter, and even Beatrice in heaven becomes pale upon thinking of these Simonist popes. Like Chaucer, Dante nonetheless sees the clerical state as the highest calling. During his denunciation of the Simonists, Dante claims that he would utter words much heavier than these, how it's not easy to imagine, but that he is prevented by reverence for those exalted keys that Pope Nicholas III held within the happy life. Dante maintains his respect, even reverence, for the office of the Pope, while disdaining the sinners who held that office. A similar meeting occurs on the fifth terrace of Mount Purgatory. There, Dante meets the avaricious Pope Adrian V. Adrian commands him to rise as Dante bows down to him. Adrian calls him a fellow servant, and he quotes Matthew 22:30, "When the dead rise again, there is no marrying and giving in marriage. They are as the angels in heaven are." The notion here is that likewise, when the dead rise again, there will be no popes, no clergy, no laity. In the afterlife, at least, there will no longer be a vocational hierarchy. And in this life, in which Dante and Chaucer do suggest a vocational hierarchy exists, the vocations in the states other than those who pray are nonetheless afforded dignity. Those not called to the religious life, those who fight and dig, and sell and build and teach and do everything else, they too are instruments of God, though of a different and baser metal, iron, not gold. But as the wife of Bath explains in a slightly different context, "For well ye can know, the Lord in his household, he doth not every vessel all of gold, some be of tree, and do her Lord's service." And a wide variety of lay vocations are useful and necessary. And one other feature levels out the hierarchy of vocations in this life, and that's the possibility of corruption. All estates and vocations can rust. Witness the miller, reeve, and shipman, the general prologue, for instance. In Dante, we see the corruption among poets, soldiers, and kings besides clerics. All that being said, however, we should not lose sight of the fact of what was mentioned earlier. Corruption of the best is the worst. Any debasement of the lay vocation will never be as perverse as that of the religious vocation. Dante and the blessed in heaven, I would argue, show particular disdain for sinful clerics, especially popes. So Dante and Chaucer show us that all vocations can be corrupted, that there are various ways of going beside the way, as the wife of Bath puts it. There are various ways to vacate, to vacation from our vocation. And what's the cause of such vacations? Well, the easy answer is fallen humanity, but Dante offers an additional answer in the voice of Charles Martel, whom he meets in the sphere of heaven, sphere of Venus in heaven. When answering Dante's question about how good fathers can beget evil sons, Charles comments on the diverse nature of vocations as well as mispursued vocations, their avocations. Charles asks this: "Can there be citizens if men below are not diverse? with diverse duties? No, if what your master, Aristotle, writes is accurate. Thus the roots from which your tasks proceed must needs be different. So, one is born a Solon, one a Xerxes, one a Melchizedek, and another he, Daedalus, who flew through the air and lost his son. But you twist to religion one whose birth made him more fit to gird a sword, and make a king of one more fit for sermoning, so that the track you take is off the road. So Charles assumes that a distribution of labor is necessary for a functioning society, with people called to various vocations, such as rulers, priests, and artists. He also assumes that some are forced or persuaded into pursuing calls they're not fit for. Such are more prone to corrupt a legitimate and good calling, if it's not truly their calling. And how many times do we see what Charles describes today with our students, particularly when their parents encourage them to pursue fields of studies that will yield them lucrative jobs, but jobs they are not dispositionally suited for? Certainly there can be dire social ramifications of the young being led to avocations. Dante describes numerous wolves in prominent church positions who jeopardize their flocks because they're not suited to be shepherds. Nonetheless, Dante does indicate that pursuing an avocation is not sufficient to merit hell, though. In the third canto of the Paradiso, Dante meets two nuns, Picardo Donati, which is actually his sister-in-law, and the Empress Constance. And both of them were called to be nuns, but later left the religious life more and less willingly, respectively. But nonetheless, both are saved and now in heaven. We suspect that some of Chaucer's pilgrims are not dispositionally suited for their vocations either. For instance, neither the monk nor the prioress seem fit for a religious vocation. Nonetheless, especially given Chaucer the pilgrim's live and let live attitude in the general prologue, it's hard for us readers to despair of the salvation of either one. The general call of a Christian pilgrim, alongside repentance and mercy, for both poets seem to conclude, trumps any particular vocation or avocation. And it's not all bad news for particular vocations in the comedy and the tales. For one, both poets reflect on the merits of their own poetic vocation. And part of their particular vocation is to display exemplary models of people living out their vocations. In the Sphere of Mars, Dante expresses his doubt about his own poetic vocation to his ancestor Cassiagita, who tells him, "All falsehood set aside, let all that you have seen be manifest, and let them scratch wherever it may itch. For if at the first taste your words molest, they will, when they have been digested, end as living nourishment. Don't spare the painful truth," Cassiagita tells Dante. Chaucer is similarly concerned with telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. In fact, he warns us a couple of times that we might not want to hear what he has to say, particularly when he's reciting the tales of Charles. He's committed to accuracy. And like Dante, such accuracy is for the sake of living nourishment. In his retraction, Chaucer says, "For our book, the Bible, saith," from Romans 15:4, "all that is written for our doctrine, and that is mean entente." And later he asks forgiveness for any tale that fails to do so. The other most explicit statement of the purpose of the poet's vocation comes at the end of the general prologue, when Harry Bailey sets forth the criteria on which the winning tale will be decided, the one with the best sentence and most solace, echoing the classical twofold end of literature, dulce et utile, sweet and useful, entertaining and educative. Part of the educative utile nature of the comedy and the tales is the exemplary models of people living out their vocations. The use of such models set forth for the reader is akin to the age-old mentor-disciple relationship of the general Christian vocation. In the comedy, only the inhabitants of the Purgatorio are capable of change, of being educated. And the go-to pedagogical tool there is the use of exemplars, positive and negative, of the 7 deadly sins and their opposed virtues. Readers of the comedy are likewise educated by means of images of the blessed who have perfectly lived out their vocations, as well as sinners, repentant or otherwise, who have failed to do so. As he ascends through the heavens, Dante encounters and describes for the reader model theologians, teachers, soldiers, rulers, contemplatives, disciples. The so-called ideal portraits of the general prologue likewise set forth standards for the 3 estates. Parson, knight, and plowman all exemplify the righteous living out of respective vocations. And various tales also set forth ideals for rulers, Duke Theseus in the Knight's Tale, wives, Griselda from The Clerk's Tale, maybe. Dame Prudence from The Tale of Melavie. And religious, Saint Cecilia of The Second Nun's Tale. Of course, like his Italian counterpart, Chaucer fills his poem with negative examples as well. And it's very likely that we readers are not ideal figures. Like Dante, we need to be purged of our sins. Like Chaucer, we need to confess these sins, as he does at the end of his poem, with the Parson's Tale and Retraction. Reading both poems allows us to do what Jeremiah says the Lord commands, and what the parson quotes to begin his tale, which is actually a long examination of conscience. Stondeth upon the ways, on seeth and oxeth of old apothis, that is to sign of old sentences, which is the good way, and walketh in that way, and ye shall find refreshinga for your souls. If we're to walk on the way that leads to the refreshing of our souls in the heavenly Jerusalem, we need to look and inquire about the old ways and find the good among them. Dante and Chaucer show multiple ways, byways, and divergent paths that we can travel on in this life. By showing these in a comprehensive manner, we're able to judge among them, especially when such paths are compared to the ideal, exemplary ones. We see that there are multiple ways we can go beside the way, like the wife of Bath, but also that there are means by which we can once again get back to the path that does not stray, and that there are all sorts of vocations that we and our students can possess that travel up this path. And so that's what I want to say about sort of the general spectrum of vocations presented in Dante and Chaucer. Now, the rest of your handout has a couple of things I'll point to before we can maybe have a discussion. The Dryden, the long Dryden quote, which I won't bore you by reading, is that's where he famously says that Chaucer shows God's plenty. And basically his argument is here that people haven't changed. And I had to remind my students of this on a fairly regular basis. People in the Middle Ages were human beings. They were actual people. And so that means they were like us. Now, our careers, our vocations have changed. And so Dryden's point at the very end of this quote is that even though we're called by other names than those of monks, friars, canons, and lady abbesses and nuns, it doesn't matter. Mankind's ever the same, and nothing lost out of nature, though everything is altered. So I mean, we're the pilgrims in the general prologue. We're all those people that Dante presents in Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, though some of our particular names of our callings, and some of the callings themselves, have changed. I still think their portrayals of vocation is useful for us as we consider our own and our students. And then the final section of your handout. These are questions that I often give to undergraduates with the general prologue to Canterbury Tales, sort of help them keep track of who's who. And I sort of want to direct your attention to the bottom part of this handout, the big questions. Because really, as they're going portrait by portrait, pilgrim by pilgrim, the key thing I want them to look for is, what does each pilgrim love? What does each pilgrim love? And then that can lead into vocational discussions. Well, how does that relate to whatever their calling is? And then more specifically, I think it's worthwhile for them to ask, like, which pilgrim are you most like, and why? That is, if you were on this pilgrimage, who would you be? And we could talk about that in a minute. And then given that, would you be satisfied with that vocation, with that calling of that person? And how is your intended calling similar or different than that pilgrim in the general prologue? So that I would certainly like to talk about, but first let me just open up to any questions that any of you might have thus far.
Hey, I'm not familiar enough with that Charles Martel passage. Is the implication that ill fit is what produces evil sons?
No.
In the discussion.
No. So like that's just another part of the discussion. It's really like what causes evil, and one cause of evil is mispursued avocations.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm losing my voice, but a bit of an aside. I was noticing there's some interesting parallels as you set out. Do you think Boethius would also fit in well with this? As a man who his vocation is, he seems to have lost sight of the proper capable of his vocation, he's despondent in his sin and so on. He needs a guide to help lead him back.
Yeah.
Would we be forcing things?
I'm supposed to repeat questions, so like basically, what would Boethius? How's he fit into this? Yeah, there's a guy who, yeah, like I'm called to be this noble, just politician, and that didn't work out. And so, what do we? And that happens today. When does our vocation, even if it's a legitimate one, when does it fail? And we can lose out or lose the available means of pursuing that vocation. But you're right. That sort of mentor, that exemplar, to like get back on track as much as you can, because Boethius, he's not going to be a politician anymore. And maybe like Dante being exiled, because that's a similar. Boethius' situation is much worse, obviously, but it does open up a different calling then to write this consolation, so become more of a philosopher. No more questions right now? Let me know when you have more. I'll ask this question. The three estates, those medieval three estates, those who pray, those who fight, those who dig. That's a pretty clear hierarchy for Dante and Chaucer, but as I tried to point out today, like they don't mind attacking the highest estate. In fact, I think attack it with more fervor because they want to hold it up to a higher standard. Do we have a hierarchy of vocations today? If so, is that the one we have? It's not. So what is, do we have a hierarchy?
Yes.
And so how do we arrange our vocations?
Who's we? Who are we? I mean, who are you?
That's right. I mean, are we talking about like a classical Christian school? And no, that's not what I'm talking about. But we do need to ask that as well. So well, let's start with that one. Like, how does a classical Christian school, do they privilege any particular vocations? I can't easily answer that, so this is a real question. This is not a fake question. This is, every once I had to explain that to my students. This isn't a fake question. This is a real one this time, people.
Well, I mean, practically, we don't offer vo-tech type things much in a classical school. That's really not where we're.
So those who dig are sort of
Well,
left out?
Well, at the same time, I think if they're educated classically, I think they will step into anything and be able to learn to do what it is. So I don't even know that my statement is a fair one to say we aren't. I mean, that was just my.
So yes, you might not necessarily be privileging them, but you're at least preparing them for any potential vocation.
I think you're right, and that can be an easy blind spot for us, though, right? Because we value learning so much, and all of us are doing it because we value learning so much, that it can be like, are we a school for blue-collar workers, right? And that's not, like, for most of us, that's not the sales pitch we make, right? And it can be an easy blind spot that we start to overvalue academic achievement, right? Instead of, but that's not Christian, right? That's not the kind of egalitarian invitation of the gospel, so.
Well, there's some example of a carpenter I'm thinking of.
Right.
And a shepherd.
Yeah. What about outside of classical education schools? When you're on this campus, you say outside the gates of opportunity. So out there, is there a hierarchy of, yeah?
I think it's based on wealth. Right? By and large, we look at successful, prosperous people, and those are the ones who at the top are Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and all of that. Those are the people we want to emulate. So go to a college that will give you a high-paying job so you can be successful and have your 3-car garage and 6-figure sports car and perfect
2 dogs.
kids. Yeah.
Well, maybe kids.
Yeah.
Maybe. So our first estate is those who make money.
I think so.
What's our second estate?
I'm not disagreeing with that, but I think you could actually put, I think above that, you have those who are famous, because some are famous for making money, right? And most who are famous have managed to make money, so maybe they're coextensive, but you know that we have this sort of like the elite class, because some are creators, some are businessmen, some other things, but it's like the people with, over 1 million Instagram followers, right, are like the first estate, maybe for the younger generation.
Those who are famous.
Yeah.
Okay. Those on Twitter.
I think you have to be careful in the church too, because I think especially mainstream evangelicals, there's this hierarchy of you're called into the ministry.
Right.
And so other people think that if, they might think if they take a job that's not, quote, in the ministry, that they're taking a lower calling or a lower road. I mean, we work with a lot of college students that have expressed this, and they do see a hierarchy in callings within the church.
All right, so they sometimes have that medieval perception.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And do you have students who, I think, is this what you're saying, that they think the only way I can really serve God is to be a missionary, be a preacher?
In the ministry,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we see that at the CFO.
And a connection with that evangelical kind of the context where we've lost the biblical view of calling can be, if we're not careful in the classical movement, can be reinforced in that with the college ready, kind of, if you're not in this elite class, then you don't have a calling. So going back to what we said at first about the need to recognize all callings as callings from God, and all things worthy and can be done to the glory of God.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because even outside of religiously affiliated colleges, there's a drive to use this vocational language and to tell people they're called. Now, if you're a secular school, it's a little bit confusing to me about who's the caller. So they had to find ways around that, but sometimes we forget. Sometimes people forget that there is a caller who's calling us to whatever that is we're to do.
I have a question. Could you speak a little bit more to maybe a backstory as to what got you to the point where you started pulling these things out and talking about vocation? Because the vocational aspect is often kind of cast aside in the classical setting. And so I'm just wondering if, your
Like my own
motivation-
particular interest in this?
Yeah.
There was a fun reading group about vocation I wanted to join, and I like the people in it. And so but it got me interested, got me thinking about my manifold vocation. We all have a lot of vocations that we're called to, and I'm thinking about outside the gates of opportunity. There's, I think a lot of people just only consider their profession as a calling. That's a dangerous thing, if that's the narrow-minded focus that you have. So that's really where my interest initially stems. But and then, like I said, I wasn't happy with this medieval claim in this vocational book that there's not the stronger calling there. But anything else about higher? Just a quick note: the physician. Doesn't all the parents of your students all want your kids to be doctors, their kids to be doctors and such? And why is that? Is it to help people? Is it to make money? And so there's a physician, there's a doctor in the general prologue. And I'll show you a picture of him. Brought in a few portraits of some of these. I wasn't sure how this discussion would go. But there he is. And Chaucer is so full of superlatives in the general prologue. Everyone's the best. Everyone just knows everything. And so this is, I've cut a ton out of this portrait. But this guy knows everything. He knows his Galen, he knows his Hippocrates, and there's a giant list of names none of us have even heard of. He knows every medical authority ever. And he knows all metals, chemicals, properties that are conducive to health. And what's the one he loves most? Gold. He loves gold, special. And the implication is it's probably not for medicinal purposes why he likes gold. That in some sense hasn't changed people's motivation. And you also have that sort of sinister relationship he has with the pharmacist, and sort of giving each other business, and you think not the most pure motives. So what are the motives for why our students or why their parents want them to pursue these various vocations? So one thing I think Dante and Chaucer indicate is that we're all called on this general Christian vocation. We're all pilgrims. And that's what I think is very attractive about both of these poets in one sense. Because when I look at the general prologue, I see this company of 30 pilgrims. And think about how vastly different they all are. Every trade, upper class, lower class, all estates, good, evil. And yet, here they are all together with a common purpose. Literally to go on a pilgrimage, but metaphorically, they all have this common, general Christian vocation. And that's what brings them together, this really discrete group of individuals. Do we have that today in any sense? Do we have any shared vocation? Especially when it's hard to say that's the case with Christianity anymore, outside the gates of opportunity, for instance, or outside your walls. Like, is there anything that would tie such a diverse group of people together today, that would bring them to one place? Is there any calling that would do that?
Football game.
Yep. Sports. Political anger, something like that. Like, yeah. Yep, that would tie us together.
Garage sales.
Garage sales brings everyone together.
Well, I don't know. I just think what would get people politically motivated to care about politics and taking
Okay.
away garage sales.
All right. All right. So united anger, maybe some things. I don't watch them, but apparently these big blockbuster movies about Avengers and stuff, or whatever, these superhero movies. Is that something that transcends all classes? We're all called to go watch these movies. I think we're losing
Well, what was the
some of
question
that.
again, what brings us together?
Yeah, like, do we, like, here, it doesn't matter if you're a miller, a knight,
Yeah.
priest, you have this Christian vocation, this idea of pilgrimage that would bring you together with this diverse group of people that you wouldn't necessarily hang out with.
Otherwise.
Yeah.
So I'm in crisis. You're gonna find yourselves. I
Coronavirus could do it.
A time with my family where we were stranded, and we were stranded with, it felt like we were in the Canterbury Tales. We had a guy whose license plate said pastor on, he had a great big truck, and he hauled us across the river, and he was smoking and swearing, but he was he was the guy that saved us all. And it was just really weird.
Chesterton talks about being in a snowstorm, being stuck with those around you. And he said that's actually, if you want diversity, get stranded, get in a snowstorm. Because otherwise, if you're choosing where you go out, you're going to hang out with people like you, and they're going to all think the same thoughts. And then, this is, I don't want to ask this about my own either, but, like, what about your church? How diverse a group? Like, what should your church look like? As far as, like, should all estates be there? And all vocations be there? And are they all there, as Chaucer's able to portray in his general prologue? Time's running out, but let me bring up at least one more topic, and then ask you for questions again. The possibility of vocations. I don't know, do you tell your students that they can be whatever they want to be? I hope not. But the fact of the matter is they can be a whole lot more today than they ever could have been. And so like if you go back to that, like the handout about the general prologue, like which pilgrim are you most like? Now, if you are a female student filling that out, and you only apply yourself to the female pilgrims, there's not many options. Wife of Bath, and not many of them are saying, yeah, I really like the Wife of Bath. Though I have had, anyway, and then the prioress, and so like that's of course for women that's the biggest difference. But even for the men, if you're a miller, what was your dad likely? A miller, all right? So you have a little choice. The biggest choice you have is really to jump up to that first estate and join the church, which is probably one reason why there's so many horrible clerics in Dante and Chaucer, because I don't want to be a miller. I'll go do this. And, well, that might be better than being a miller, but you're not suited for it. But, that is your only other option. And so it makes considering, like, what are you suited for all the more important today when they do have so many choices, whereas they lack that in their in the Middle Ages. So I think that's a interesting contrast between now and then. I was just talking to a colleague recently about the education program, about how they do disposition exams and tests. Are you suited to be a teacher? And what does it take to do that? I like children. Is that necessary, or is that sufficient? Like what are your motivations? A physician, I like gold. Is that a sufficient entrance to medical school? And so, how much consideration do your schools put into that, and do your students put into that as they think about their future goals, about their dispositions? And that's just not only for their own happiness, though that's a big part of it, but also just for human flourishing and for all they'll encounter. Any thoughts about that or questions to conclude? Yeah.
I teach drama, and we read Death of the Salesman every year. And so I love this because I could, kind of look back into this, because Death of the Salesman is all about a man who just keeps trying to do the exact same thing over and over and over, even though he's terrible at it. And so I love that, and so we've talked a lot about that. You have to be suited to it. Yeah. You can't just, I'm going to be a doctor, but I'm absolutely terrible at science and math.
Yeah, but I got grit. And I mean, that's what we wrote about. Yeah, that's what grit's good if it's aimed in the right direction, but not if you're just never going to succeed. That grit is detrimental to what you're after. Good point. Yeah.
One thing I've noticed, particularly with the young men, is there's really a lack of ambition or drive to do anything. You can talk to a sophomore or junior girl, she has, I might like to do this or that. You talk to a sophomore, like, I don't know, go home and play video games. And it's interesting that, their sense of motivation, ambition, what do they want to do with themselves? That's something I've noticed over the years with my students. It seems to be lacking.
Why do you think that's less with female students?
I have some theories, but I'm not sure. But part of it, I think culturally we live in an age of empowering women to do well. When you think about we have all this push to make STEM more opening and inviting to girls. We've had programs to promote literacy and reading scores with girls and all that, and a lot of it is boys have been left on the wayside. That would be one possibility. Are we living in a time where men have been displaced and are optional? We don't know what it means to be a man. We've lost the formal cause, so I don't know what to do with myself.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of broken homes your families come from, but how many have grown up without a father figure?
There's also a lot more competition among women because there are more women in college campuses now, and so sometimes I think that men don't have to feel like they don't have to try as hard. Maybe the younger men, it's like, sad situation.
That's interesting. Yeah, it reminds me of discussions I've heard. I'm a Roman Catholic, and so we have, among our various crises that we have right now, is one is a vocational crisis. I mean, young men don't feel a call to the priesthood, and the most interesting explanation that I've heard for it, and there's probably so many reasons for why that is, but that they don't know what a father is. Mm-hmm. And so how are they going to be a spiritual father if they don't know what an earthly father is? I thought that was sort of a frightening explanation, but maybe true. I think I saw a hand over here.
I was just wondering, in the classroom, you're trying to portray the young, I'm not going to say mostly you're young men, but that's kind of how
it's mainly women.
When you know that their parents are pulling them in a different direction, and you keep speaking into the life of this child to try to, make them aware of what you see as their giftings, and you even talk to their parents, and they just kind of, brush aside the idea that it's even possible that their child could do something that's not lofty, with a title attached to it. And it's like, it's very clear what your child is so good at. I spend 7 hours a day with this intuitive, bright, inventive kind of young person, and it's like, nope, he's clearly going to do this.
He's clearly going to be an engineer.
He clearly is not, so I cannot wait to teach this.
Yeah, well, I mean,
unless you can come and teach it more.
Yes, please invite me. I don't know where you're from, but yes. At a college, you get that secondhand. You get the parents speaking through the student, and you don't have that really close contact with the parents. I see my colleague David Peterson over there. I know he deals a lot with this. What do you do with that student?
It
What do I
really
do?
is training
Yeah.
the parent.
Yeah, I mean, I say often, I think you need to ask these questions. I don't think you can help it. And then usually I wait. And sometimes that, that bears fruit, sometimes it doesn't.
I want to echo another piece of advice I think that my colleague, Dr. Peterson, has given to students who are experiencing a vocational crisis. And correct me if I'm wrong, David, but don't you sometimes tell them that you don't matter that much? and some of it, as serious as it is to like choose the right vocation, I mean, Picardo Donati, she got saved. She was in the wrong one, and she probably didn't disrupt the world that much. And so, like, yeah, it's a really important decision, but like, it's not going to destroy your soul, or probably other people's. I mean, though it can have dire consequences, but if you have the right intentions, it's probably not the end of the world. But it's hard to see that when, well, I'd say any age, but especially when you're sort of high school, college age, and you're looking into the future, because it does seem so momentous. But David says, in the grand scheme of things, you're not that important. Was that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
No,
all
I've
right.
said that often.
I haven't said it yet, but I'm going to make sure there's no serious blowback before I do it.
I have a question, Ethan.
Yeah.
You mentioned the disposition assessments that the education department does, and I haven't really ever thought about this, but I don't know if you know the answer to this, but do people fail those? I mean, and what's the result of failing that? Is there sort of so this is something you should know as you pursue this profession? You have to counteract the fact that you're not good at this?
Yeah, like I don't know if it's any more than an FYI that you don't seem like you're suited for this, but we'll let you anyway because you got the GPA. I don't know. I don't know what their policies, and they surely differ institution to institution. I don't even know what ours is, so I was just overhearing some of the people talk about it. So.
I mean, there are times when.
So I mean, back to my my experience with Roman Catholicism. I mean, yeah, for to get entrance into seminary, you fail or you have enough red flags on a psychological examination, especially nowadays with all the crises. Then yeah, you're not coming in. They're gonna, despite the great shortage of priests, they're not going to take any risks on you if they don't see you being suited for it. English? Should we have an English disposition for English majors?
I mean, if you can do the literary analysis and you can ask the questions, you kind of, even if it's not.
You have to care. Is that what? Do you care about what you read? Where were you?
So you guys are like talking about how parents like push us into certain things.
Is this autobiographical?
I was thinking about how, as a student, I see this in fellow peers, how their parents don't only push them into certain places, but also their beliefs. They don't make their own belief theirs.
Sure.
And I actually wrote about it in one of my papers recently, so that lady right over there, that I just recently made it my own. Which is kind of cool. So, but that's also something I thought about, and I'm not a Catholic, and so, but that's also something I could see happening in priesthood or just pastors, is they're not there was a study done, they asked kids hey, why don't you go to church? And they're like why would I? They have better things to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just they're not making their own beliefs their own. So why would they go and give their life to something they don't believe in?
That's right. And so that's typically there's some sort of crisis that comes where you have to re-examine those beliefs. And either you buy into them or you alter them, but then they're your own. And if you can get to that step, then I think you're going to be way more confident about choosing your vocation or pursuing a vocation.
I don't know if this is a question, but I've been a comment, perhaps. Sorry, I kind of hate when we do that, but
I meant to ask for questions or comments. Any questions or comments?
Thank you. I had a comment. Actually.
Oh yeah, great.
I've just been really struck by the richness of what you're describing here and how it highlights kind of how many times in Scripture you see people on pilgrimage with a job that's not their calling, you know, and it's like, because in my mind, the way that I teach like Old Testament survey and New Testament is that it's really kind of a series of pilgrimages, right? That we started in Eden and eventually we end up back, right? In new heavens and new earth, and you have Abram, you have towards the promised land, you have once they're in exile, you have, you know, and you have Jesus who's in, you know,
His whole life is a pilgrimage
sort
towards his death.
Exactly, right? And we live in the church age, right? Which is a sort of pilgrimage towards, you know, the ultimate, you know, return of Christ in that. But I've just been struck as you're talking about how well this highlights in a really meaningful way, like, you know, Abraham was called, you know, a pilgrimage that wasn't his job, right? And time and time again, or the chapter, the letter of the exiles, when, you know, they're in exile and God says to plant vineyards, you know, marry your kids, have families, right? Seek the good, and he said, and don't worry, in 70 years they'll bring you back, right? Which is like most of them would be dead.
Yeah.
You know, and for us, we're on this pilgrimage, like there's no end in sight, right? And yet we have things that God has given us, you know, and I thought that was really sweet.
And doesn't it tell us that sometimes we do just have to take some other vocation? I mean, sometimes we do have to settle for maybe a vocation that we're not suited for, so that we can be that better husband, father, wife, mother, and Christian, because that Christian one triumphs. And so sometimes, yeah, just take that job that you don't want, so that you can raise your family. You know.
Right.
So.
I kind of, back to the like hierarchy thing, what would it take to change a hierarchy? Like what would...
A lot of people.
No.
With it, I mean, it would take a lot of people with, I think, with a shared belief that it mattered to do it.
So like, how come, so like, I see this a lot in like, Christians, like highly viewed Christians, they try to become part of the hierarchy, like the highest part when...
Table of influence?
Yeah.
You probably hear that around here, don't you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's probably, I'd say that's probably a legitimate calling for some. Some of us do need to do that, but that's probably not something we all have to do. Yeah. We all have our table of influence, just they're in different places. Sometimes it's the dinner table, I think. So.
And that's the balance. The balance is not just an elevated table of influence,
yeah,
but realizing that, as we say, your most important table of influence is a humble one around the home.
Oh, good.
I think it's easy to get confused or have blurred lines between what I thought I was going to do, what I wanted, what I felt like my calling was, and what God is truly calling me to do. Excuse me. I think that's easy for people to do, and someone somewhere, I can't even remember who or where, made the comment, I think it was at a conference like this a couple years ago, how do you know that God called you into this position? Because you're sitting here. You know, I mean, you just go, yeah, it feels like I don't know if I should be, guess what? He put you here right now, what are you going to do with it? And so I feel like it's easy to talk to a kid about, well, let's find out your calling. And yes, you can recognize things that students are really good at, but at the same time, you just have to say, God's in control and he's going to take you where he wants to take you. And sometimes you're going to agree with that and sometimes you're not. But what are you going to do with it when you push it?
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. If you have any more questions, I'll stick around. So thank you.
Thank you.